This is iCastNews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City. And this is Bubbling Under and Bubbling Over. Bubbling over this week? Well, let's start in Chad, where in a remarkable set of developments, where the entire parliament was flown at the last minute into the neighboring capital of Chad from the Central African Republic. Mr. Michel Djotadia, the interim president, and his prime minister have resigned. Djotadia had been backed by a minority of the people of the Central African Republic, the Muslim minority, who is the first Muslim leader in the country's history. The rebels aligned with him had gone to war after they had forced the elected president out of office. The Christian minority felt persecuted. People were seeking refuge in United Nations camps and United Nations sanctuaries. The entire Central African Republic, always a very unstable, always a very fragile regime, was becoming destabilized. Some 4,000 African Union troops have been in there on the initiative of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Ban Ki-moon today reminded reporters that there is an authorization for up to 6,000 African Union soldiers, and he pleaded with the world community, especially with the African nations, to bring up the level to 6,000 troops. Now the minority government of Muslims has resigned. The amazing action was largely the work of the leader of the neighboring Republic of Chad, Indira Debay, who Mr. Debay, at the last moment, flew every single member of the Central African Republic Parliament to his capital and had them discuss, debate, pressurized a change in the government. The Central African Republic, much troubled, is now in a state of surprise, joy for the Christian majority. French tanks, there are about 1,500 French troops in the Central African Republic. French tanks are guarding the presidential palace and will be moving, we're told, to protect the parliament. This is all a relief to the world community. The relief is being felt particularly here at the United Nations headquarters, where, although they were not intimately involved in the details of the negotiation that led to the resignation, there is a sense that there can be a reset, in the sense that the Central African Republic has had scheduled for the end of 2014 a new election, and the president was on an acting basis. Ban Ki-moon will, of course, be asking for more troops and more aid to the Central African Republic, but in a surprise development, the leader of the minority government has resigned, and it seems that there is at least a small opening for peace. On the peace front, good news out of Geneva today, or at least news that should make those who are very alarmed by the confrontation of most of the world, particularly the world led by the Big Five plus one, that is China, Russia, Great Britain, France, and the United States, plus Germany, versus Iran. The Iranian Deputy Prime Minister Abbas Araghchi today announced that there is preliminary agreement, and there will be movement this coming week to reach some terms for the 6-month interim period of backing away from Iran's march towards a nuclear power. All the details of what the Iranians brought to the table are not in. There is information coming particularly out of the Associated Press, which has good contacts with the people in Geneva. The Associated Press is reporting that Iran is insisting that most of its research facilities, that is, the university facilities, presumably, be exempted from the prohibitions on further enrichment of uranium. Whether this would suffice to meet the demands that hardliners inside Iran are insisting that Iran be given a declaratory sentence in the negotiations that recognizes their right to become a nuclear capable nation, whether this is a way of parsing the issue, saying they can do research but not have a right to enrich uranium. That remains to be seen, but it is encouraging news out of Geneva, which means that next week, bubbling under the surface will be some kind of move for negotiations, although it should be noted that on another issue involving Iran and Geneva, that it looks like right now Iran is not going to be invited to the negotiations for some kind of settlement or some kind of movement towards discussion of peace, and that's a long way of saying peace negotiations about Syria that are going to resume soon in Geneva. Again, Iran may not be involved. In another troubled spot in the world, South Sudan, this week, the United Nations has pledged extra $15 million in emergency aid to deal with the people, some 250,000 people who have fled since the middle of December into refugee camps and into ad hoc facilities, particularly around the United Nations camp in the airport. The ability of the United Nations to have civilized places for this refugee crisis to be resolved is extremely limited. Latrines are yet to be dug. Food is not being brought in. The Assistant Secretary of State of the United States, Ms. Thompson Greenfield, told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee this week, today, tragically, the world's youngest country and undoubtedly one of the most fragile democracies is in danger of shattering. And it is the danger of shattering that has the world community and the United Nations paying so much attention to resolving what is going on in South Sudan. News out of South Sudan these days is that one of the major economic powerhouses of the country that actually keeps it functioning, the oil towns in the south, are now back in the hands of the government, and rebels have fled. Whether that is in fact a fact remains to be seen. News is less than reliable coming out of what is turning into a warlike zone, if not a war zone. Certainly civil war is sputtering and flickering all around South Sudan. We will continue to keep our eye on this area. One of the reasons that information is scant coming out of South Sudan is that it's a chaotic zone, not well equipped to communicate with the world. A part of the world that is well equipped, Nauru, the little island kingdom, the second smallest country in the world. It's about 8.5 square miles. Monaco is 0.7 square miles, so it's the second smallest in the world. Nauru is suddenly raised its fees for journalists. It used to cost about $180 to get a visa to go to Nauru. They have raised that up to $7,100. This isn't simply gouging, this is censorship. Australia has established an internment camp on this little island that they're paying for the use of the land for the internment camp, where refugees coming on boats streaming out of Southeast Asia trying to go to Australia, they're being held there. And to keep people from seeing what's going on, they're going to raise fees. How much collusion there is with the Australian government remains to be seen. How much this is reminiscent of the regime of control that Americans are using to keep the press out of going to Guantanamo Bay and investigating conditions there remains to be seen. but it's funny things that islands with controlled regimes do to freedom of expression and journalists. Freedom of expression and journalists. News out of the troubled region of Somalia. Al-Shabaab, the militant Muslim rebel organization, often said to be very closely allied with the worst of the world's terrorist organizations, has declared that in 15 days, anyone found using a cell phone or an internet link, in other words, wireless or wired communication to deal with the other world, the outside world, will be considered an actor in line with the enemy. In line with the enemy means an enemy of the state, the Al-Shabaab state. They earlier had outlawed anyone listening to the BBC radio. There have been Al-Shabaab threats against people using cell phones. Now they simply want to ban internet. Well, internet connections are coming in Somalia. Mogadishu is about to go online with fiber optic broadband capability. Al-Shabaab, the militant Muslim organization, does not want people talking to the outside world. Another form of censorship. Less than good news as 2014 begins. Somalia, of course, is a land that has been racked with conflict and has been semi-governed for more than 20 years. News coming out of Somalia will be restricted in the Al-Shabaab-controlled regions. Thugs don't like information. Finally, two other bits of news floating around the world. One, in a bizarre development in one of the most bizarre and restricted parts of the world, North Korea. Dennis Rodman, the flamboyant, outspoken, multi-tattooed, multi-nose ring, lip ring wearing former NBA star, got himself in a bit of a hot water this week by going to North Korea with some colleagues from the National Basketball Association to celebrate the 31st birthday of the young leader of North Korea. And he managed to say live on CNN that an American missionary, a 45-year-old man who was being held prisoner, may have done something that got him into the clutches of the North Korean police. When he was chastised for this, Dennis Rodman, who this week sang happy birthday to the young leader of North Korea, rethought himself, and he said, "It's been a very stressful day. Some of my teammates were leaving because of pressure from their families and business associates. My dreams of basketball diplomacy was quickly falling apart. I'd been drinking. It's not an excuse, but by the time the interview happened, I was upset." Well, basketball diplomacy has its ups and downs. Diplomacy with North Korea is a very fraught thing. Dennis Rodman singing happy birthday to the leader of North Korea, well, let's just say this. It's very far from Marilyn Monroe singing happy birthday to John Fitzgerald Kennedy. In fact, it's something virtually out of this world. And speaking out of this world, the Danish Meteorological Society this week has said that based on 2 years of research done at a Hawaiian observatory, they have now determined that the dark side of the moon emits turquoise light. Turquoise light, it's not black on the dark side of the moon, which may, for those of us who remember the 60s rock band Pink Floyd, answer the question about the color of the dark side of the moon. So the answer and the color this week, the color that things are bubbling under and bubbling over is turquoise. Not pink, Pink Floyd, turquoise. That's Bubbling Under and Bubbling Over for the beginning of January 2014, the year of the horse. It may be a turquoise year of the horse. For Bubbling Under and Bubbling Over for iCastNews.com, live and direct from United headquarters in New York City, where we may or may not be in the turquoise light, I'm Jonathan Sanders.